Imagine this. You're in your home, the same home where you grew up, where you got married, where your children were born. Outside, there are screams. They've been going on for 3 days, but now they're closer. Now they're on your street. Your husband left to defend the walls a week ago. He hasn't come back, and you already know what that means. Your 12-year-old son is hiding in the cellar. You told him not to come out. No matter what happened, don't make a sound. Then the door breaks down. 3 soldiers walk in. They don't shout or threaten, they just work in silence, like men who've done this hundreds of times before. One grabs your arm, another searches the rooms, and the third one finds the cellar. You hear your son scream your name. It's the last time you'll ever hear his voice. They drag you into the street where there are other women. Some you recognize, the baker's wife, the priest's daughter, your neighbor you used to talk to every morning. None of them look each other in the eyes, they all know what's coming. An officer walks between you, checking teeth, feeling arms, writing numbers on a wax tablet. He doesn't ask your names because he doesn't care. To him, you're no longer people. You're inventory. Her name was Alyssa, at least that's what her mother called her. In a few weeks, that name would be erased forever, replaced by a number, then by a Latin word that meant nothing. But she didn't know that yet. Standing in that square, watching her city burn, she still believed the worst was over. She was wrong. And this thing you're imagining, it's not fiction. It happened exactly like this in Carthage, in Corinth, in Jerusalem, in hundreds of cities that made the mistake of resisting Rome. Because here's what they never taught you in school. Rome couldn't stop conquering. It was an empire addicted to human flesh, and without fresh slaves every decade, its economy collapsed within a generation. The fields, the mines, the aqueducts, everything ran on amid disposable bodies, and when a body wore out, it had to be replaced. Men died quickly in battle, a sword and it was over. But women were too valuable to waste like that. What Rome did to the wives of its enemies wasn't chaos or the brutality of war. It was a system, an industrial protocol perfected over centuries to extract every ounce of value from a human being. And today, you're going to learn exactly how that machine worked. If this kind of history fascinates you, hit subscribe and drop a like. That's what keeps us bringing these stories to light. Now let's go back to the moment when Carthage fell. The morning of May 29th, 146 BC, the last Carthaginian defenders had gone silent on the walls. After 3 years of siege, the city had finally broken. But what happened next wasn't the chaotic looting you see in movies. There was no wild rampage, no soldiers running through streets grabbing whatever they could find. Instead, there was something far more terrifying. Order. Roman legions moved through the city in organized units, carrying lists, quotas, and specific instructions written on scrolls in leather pouches. The military manuals called it the Harvest Protocol. And if you think about that name for a second, you'll understand everything about how Rome saw conquered people. Harvest, like they were collecting wheat. Like these were crops to be gathered, rather than human beings with lives and memories and dreams. Within the first 6 hours, Roman officers had set up classification stations in every major square of the city, complete with tables, scribes, and lines of soldiers, bringing in captured civilians, everything organized, everything documented. The men above 12 years old were eliminated immediately, not in a battle rage or hot blood, but lined up in groups of 50 and removed systematically after they'd already surrendered their weapons. The Romans had learned from previous wars that leaving the males alive meant rebellions 20 years later, and they'd made that mistake before, so they weren't going to make it again. But the women faced something entirely different. Alyssa stood in line for 7 hours, watching the sun move across the sky, while soldiers processed the women ahead of her, one by one, the same routine every time. When her turn came, a Roman officer grabbed her jaw and turned her face left, then right, pried open her mouth to count her teeth, and squeezed her arms, her shoulders, her waist. Then he wrote something on his tablet, just 2 words, prima forma, meaning first quality. She didn't understand Latin, and she didn't know. Those words would determine everything that happened to her next. That they meant she was worth more. That they meant her suffering would last longer. Young women between 14 and 25 were the premium category, and Roman records from the Carthaginian campaign list exactly 4,200 women in this group, each one assigned an identification number, each one given a price. These numbers weren't abstract statistics, they were human beings reduced to entries in a ledger, treated like livestock in economic reports. And the efficiency was staggering. In just 6 days, approximately 50,000 people had been processed, registered, categorized, and prepared for distribution across the Mediterranean, and 25,000 of them were women. Let that sink in. In less than a week, Rome had processed enough human beings to fill a modern sports stadium, and they did it with the cold precision of a factory operation, because that's exactly what it was. 3 days later, Alyssa walked up a wooden plank, onto a ship with her hands tied in front of her by rough rope that had already rubbed her wrists raw. The harbour was chaos, with dozens of ships, thousands of women being loaded like cargo, Roman soldiers shouting orders, and the smell of smoke still drifting from the burning city behind them. And then she went below deck, where the smell hit her first: sweat, fear, and human waste. The air was thick and warm, hard to breathe, even with the ventilation shafts the Romans had built into the hull. Because these ships weren't normal cargo vessels. Archaeological discoveries have revealed something disturbing about their construction, including ventilation shafts running into the holds, water supply systems, and drainage channels. These ships were built specifically to transport people, designed to keep human cargo alive during weeks-long journeys across the Mediterranean. They were floating prisons. Alyssa found a spot against the wall where there were already dozens of women, some I'd recognized from her neighborhood. They didn't speak because there was nothing to say. A sailor came down once a day with a bucket of water and a bag of hard bread, but it was never enough for everyone, and the Romans designed it that way on purpose. By creating scarcity, they created competition, letting the prisoners fight among themselves for crumbs, which kept them too busy to think about resistance. The ship captains kept detailed logs during these voyages, recording the physical condition of their human cargo at regular intervals, noting who was getting sick, who was losing weight, who was giving up. Around the 3rd week, Alyssa stopped counting the days, stopped thinking about Carthage, and stopped remembering her son's face. That was the goal. Mortality during transport averaged around 15%, meaning 1 out of every 7 women loaded onto those ships never reached the other side, and the Romans considered this an acceptable loss, just a cost of doing business. Those who died were thrown overboard, their deaths recorded in the shipping logs, alongside damaged cargo and spoiled supplies. Same column, same bureaucratic indifference. When the ship finally reached Ostia, Rome's main port, Alyssa had been at sea for 26 days, weighing less than she had since childhood, with infected wrists where the ropes had cut them. But she was alive, and she didn't know yet that being alive was going to be worse. Why do you think this part of Roman history gets left out of the textbooks? Let me know in the comments. The slave market at Ostia had a smell Alyssa would never forget. Oil and perfume used to make the merchandise look healthier, sweat from hundreds of bodies packed into holding cells, and something else underneath, something like fear given physical form. Before the auction, they prepared her by stripping off what remained of her Carthaginian clothes and burning them in front of her, then giving her a simple tunic that marked her as property. They washed her, fed her just enough to take the edge off her starving appearance, and rubbed oil into her skin to make it shine. A dealer inspected her one more time, checking for any defects that might lower her price, then nodded with satisfaction at what he saw. And then they brought her to the platform. The auction block was a raised wooden stage in the centre of the market, surrounded by Roman men, some taking notes, some just watching, some already counting coins. The noise was overwhelming, with dealers shouting prices, buyers haggling, and the constant shuffle of human beings being moved from one holding pen to another. Alyssa stood there while a dealer grabbed her arm and raised it to show off her muscle tone, opened her mouth to display her teeth, and listed her qualities in rapid Latin, while buyers shouted questions. Where is she from? Carthage. Is she trained for household work? Unknown. Is she fertile? Probably. She's young. The bidding started at 15 silver coins and ended at 28. A man in expensive robes walked up and handed over the money while the dealer gave him a receipt, a piece of paper that said he now owned another human being, and just like that, it was done. Alyssa didn't understand the words being spoken and didn't know how much she'd sold for. She only knew that when the man grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a waiting cart, she was supposed to follow. She was property now, legal property, with all the rights of a chair or a cooking pot. The man who bought her didn't look cruel, and he didn't look kind either. He looked like someone who'd just completed a transaction, nothing more. He would never learn her real name, never ask about her family, her home, or her son who screamed for her in that cellar. To him, she wasn't a person with a history. She was an investment, a tool, a thing. That night, Alyssa was given a new name, Tertia, meaning third, because she was the third slave purchased that week. Everything else about who she used to be began to disappear. They shaved her head on the second day, not as punishment, just procedure, since new slaves arrived with lice sometimes, and it was easier to shave everyone than to check. Alyssa watched her dark hair fall to the stone floor, the same hair her mother used to braid when she was a little girl, gone in 30 seconds. That was only the beginning, because Rome had perfected the art of erasing human beings. Not killing them, but erasing them, taking everything that made a person who they were and grinding it down to nothing. The process was systematic. First came the name, as Alyssa became Tertia, and anyone who called her by her old name was punished. Eventually, she stopped thinking of herself as Alyssa because the name felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who died in Carthage. Then came the language. She was forbidden from speaking Punic, her native tongue, and other Carthaginian slaves in the household were kept separate, so there would be no shared language, no shared memory. Then came the religion. Her small amulet of Tanit, the goddess her mother had prayed to, was found and destroyed, and she was told Roman gods protected this house now, that she would honour them or face consequences. Then came the memories themselves, and this was the cruelest part. Rome didn't just want obedient slaves, they wanted slaves who forgot they had ever been anything else. Tertia was forbidden from talking about Carthage, about her husband, about her son. At first she held on to those memories, desperately, replaying them in her mind at night when no one could see, but years passed and the memories became harder to reach. She would try to picture her son's face and find only fog, try to remember her husband's voice and hear only silence. After 6 years, she realised she had stopped trying. Some women were taken to specialised facilities, places designed for what the Roman records called transformation. Archaeological excavations have uncovered these buildings, with small rooms containing restraining equipment and drainage systems, evidence of industrial-scale psychological destruction. The programs lasted about 6 months, long enough to ensure pregnancy. Children born from these forced unions became property of the Roman state, living evidence of conquest, and some did not survive infancy if they resembled their mothers too closely. Those who survived were raised as Romans, never knowing their mothers' true names or origins. The system had one goal: complete erasure, transform a human being with a history, a culture, and a family into a blank tool that existed only to serve Rome. And it worked. 20 years after Carthage fell, Tertia barely remembered the girl who had once been called Alyssa. That person felt like a dream, something that happened to someone else long ago in a city that no longer existed. But here's the darkest truth of all. Rome didn't do this because Romans were uniquely evil. They did it because they had to. The Roman economy was structurally dependent on slavery at a level few people understand. At the empire's peak, between 25 and 40% of the Italian population were slaves, and Rome itself had around 400,000 slaves out of 1 million inhabitants. The great agricultural estates that fed the legions ran entirely on slave labour. The mines that produced the silver to pay the soldiers used slaves until they dropped dead. And the aqueducts, roads, and construction projects were all built on disposable human bodies. Without this endless supply of free labour, the entire Roman system would grind to a halt, and the senators who ran the empire knew it. And here's the problem with disposable bodies. They run out. Slaves died, got sick, and aged out of useful labour, and the Roman system didn't allow for natural reproduction to replace them fast enough. They needed fresh supplies constantly, which meant they needed new conquests constantly. Every decade without a major war meant fewer slaves entering the market. Fewer slaves meant agricultural crisis. Agricultural crisis meant hungry legions, and hungry legions meant political instability. It was a machine that had to keep feeding, or it would collapse. So Rome kept conquering, kept destroying cities, and kept processing women and children into the slavery pipeline, not out of sadism, but out of economic necessity. The addiction metaphor isn't poetic exaggeration, it's structural reality. And when the conquests finally stopped in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, when the borders stabilised and new slaves stopped flowing in, the system began to collapse. Slave prices skyrocketed, agriculture failed, and the empire started transitioning to a different system of tenant farmers bound to the land. The end of Roman expansion wasn't just military decline, it was withdrawal, an economy built on human trafficking learning to live without its fix, and the scars of that addiction would last for centuries. The terror created by Roman methods changed everything. Communities across the Mediterranean developed elaborate systems to protect their women, including underground hideouts, networks of caves and tunnels where families could hide during raids. Archaeological discoveries confirm these shelters across former Roman provinces, from Britain to North Africa. Entire villages were redesigned around the possibility of Roman attack, with secret passages built into homes and escape routes planned for every family. Some parents deliberately marked their daughters' faces to make them less attractive to Roman raiders looking for premium merchandise. Marriage traditions changed too, with some societies arranging marriages for women at younger ages, believing pregnancy might reduce their value to slavers, and some women chose a different path entirely. When the city of Numantia fell to Rome in 133 BC, the surviving women didn't wait to be processed. They threw themselves from the walls and walked into burning buildings, choosing fire over the slave ships. The Romans called it madness, but these women had heard the stories. They knew what waited for them in Ostia, in the markets, in the transformation centres. Death was the only freedom Rome couldn't take away. That choice became a pattern across the Mediterranean, from Spain to Judea, as women facing Roman capture made the same calculation. Some poisoned themselves, and some chose to end their family's suffering before it could begin, not out of despair, but out of defiance. They refused to become inventory. New words entered languages across the Mediterranean, words to describe specific types of Roman cruelty that hadn't needed names before. When entire societies reorganize around protecting women from systematic violence, it means that violence has become a defining element of daily existence. That was Rome's true legacy, not just the roads and aqueducts, but the fear, the trauma passed down through generations, and the knowledge that civilization itself could become a machine for destroying human beings. Whatever happened to Tertia, the historical record doesn't say. She was one of 25,000, one number among thousands in the Roman archives, her entire existence reduced to a few marks on a wax tablet. Maybe she lived a long life in service to a Roman family. Maybe she died young from disease or exhaustion, or maybe she eventually earned her freedom as an old woman in a foreign land with no memory of home. We don't know, and that uncertainty is perhaps the cruelest part of all. What we know is this: she existed. She had a name before they took it, a family before they destroyed it, and a life before Rome decided that life was worth 28 silver coins. And she wasn't alone. Carthage, Corinth, Jerusalem, Numantia, hundreds of cities and hundreds of thousands of women, all fed into the same machine that never stopped, always hungry for more. The glory of Rome was built on this foundation, on suffering and silence. Every aqueduct, every road, every marble temple was built on the backs of people who were never asked if they wanted to contribute. The next time you see a documentary celebrating Roman engineering or military genius, remember this. Remember Alyssa. Remember the ships with their specialized cargo holds. Remember the markets where humans were sold like furniture. And remember that all of it was perfectly legal, perfectly normal, perfectly Roman. Now I want to hear from you. We've covered Rome's treatment of conquered women, but this empire has 1,000 more dark chapters that never made it into the history books we read today. What topic should we explore next? Drop your suggestion in the comments below. Your ideas shape what comes next on this channel. Until next time.